Harasha. Okay, devotees, we're continuing with our reading of Prabhupada-lilamrita. Okay? We're in the 3rd volume, 1st chapter still. Yeah, let's just have a look, see where we are. Let's see now, what level are we at? All right. Okay. Nama Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachadeshatarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchkalpatrubhyascha kripa sindhubhyevacha Patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Okay. So we're in San Francisco, 1967, I think. Yeah, 1967. Sam Spearstra, who became Shamsunda, tall and slender, with curly reddish gold hair, was athletic. He had trained as an Olympic skier, yet artistic. He was a writer and wood sculptor. He had graduated from Reed College in Oregon and gone on as a Fulbright scholar to a small college in Switzerland, where he obtained an MA in philosophy. He was popular, as Mukunda saw him, the epitome of the rugged individualist. When Mukunda had visited Sam at his mountain lookout tower and told him about Swamiji and Krishna consciousness, Sam had been intrigued by the new ideas. Sam's life had nearly reached a dead end, but he had seen hope in what Mukunda and Janaki had been saying about Swamiji. After spending only a few days with Mukunda, Sam had been eager to help him establish a temple of Krishna consciousness in San Francisco. Sam was the one who knew the local rock stars and had persuaded them to appear at the Avalon with Swami Bhaktivedanta, whom he had never met. Sam had seen Swamiji for the first time when Swamiji had arrived at the San Francisco airport, and Sam had later insisted that he had seen a flash of light come from Swamiji's body. At first, Sam had been afraid to say anything, nor had he known what to say. Prabhupada was completely new to him and seemed so elevated. But The day after the program at the Avalon, when Mukunda told Prabhupada that Sam had arranged the dance, Prabhupada sent for him to find out how much money they had made. Sitting across from Prabhupada, who sat behind his small desk, Sam informed him that they had made about $1,500 profit. Well then, Srila Prabhupada said, you will be the treasurer. Then Srila Prabhupada asked him, what is your idea of God? God is one, Sam replied. Prabhupada asked, what is the purpose of worshipping God? Sam replied, to become one with God. So Prabhupada asked, what's the purpose of worshipping God? Sam replied, to become one with God. No, Prabhupada said, you cannot become one with God. God and you are always two different individuals, but you can become one in interest with him. And then he told Sam about Krishna. After they talked, Prabhupada said, you can come up every day and I will teach you how to do books, how to be the treasurer, in other words. So Sam began meeting with Prabhupada for half an hour a day to learn bookkeeping. Sam, I had never been very good at keeping books, and I really didn't want to do it. But it was a good excuse to come and see Swamiji every day. He would chew me out when I would spend too much money or when I couldn't balance the books properly. I really loved the idea that he was so practical, that he knew bookkeeping. He became so much more of a friend from the beginning, rather than some idealized person from another sphere of life. I took almost all my practical questions to him. I learned to answer things for myself based on the way Swamiji always answered day-to-day problems. And the first thing he made me do was to get married to my girlfriend, unquote. Mukunda and his wife, Janaki, whose apartment was just down the hall from Srila Prabhupada's, were the only couple Srila Prabhupada had already initiated and married. Mukunda, who often wore his strand of large red japa beads in two loose loops around his neck, had grown long hair and a short, thick black beard since coming to San Francisco. He had entered the summer of love spirit of Haight-Ashbury and was acquainted with many of the popular figures. Although occasionally earning money as a musician, he spent most of his time promoting Prabhupada's mission, especially by meeting people to arrange gala programs like the one at the Avalon. He was a leader in bringing people to assist Prabhupada, yet he had no permanent sense of commitment. He was helping because it was fun. Having little desire to be different from his many San Francisco friends, he did not strictly follow Prabhupada's principles for regulated spiritual life. In his exchanges with Srila Prabhupada, Mukunda liked to assume a posture of fraternal camaraderie rather than one of menial servitude, and Srila Prabhupada reciprocated. Sometimes, however, Prabhupada would assert himself as the teacher. Once, when Prabhupada walked into Mukunda's apartment, he noticed a poster on the wall showing a matador with a cape and sword going after a bull. "This is a horrible picture," Srila Prabhupada exclaimed, his face showing displeasure. Mukunda looked at the poster, realizing for the first time what it meant. "Yes, it is horrible," he said, and tore it off the wall. Actually, when Prabhupada first came to Bhaktivedanta Manor, first time, like the middle of 1973, more or less, and stayed for quite some time, Shamsundar had designed a special letterhead for, maybe just for the temple, but I think more for inviting people to come and visit Prabhupada, because he did that a lot. He invited famous people, quite a number, to come and meet Srila Prabhupada and discuss. So on that special letterhead, right in the center at the top, was I think the skull with horns of a bull, or a cow. The head, like you get sometimes people, some people, they stick up on the wall some animal head or skull of an animal, something like that. So he did that. And when Prabhupada saw it, oh my gosh. Prabhupada said, "Oh, so now we are killing cows?" Prabhupada was not happy at all. Srila Prabhupada was eager to have someone play the mridanga properly during the kirtans, and Mukunda, a musician, was a likely candidate. Mukunda: "The day the drum came, I asked Swamiji if I could learn, and he said yes. I asked him when, and he said, 'When do you want?' 'Now?' I asked. He said yes. I was a little surprised to get such a quick appointment, but I brought the drum to his room, and he began to show me the basic beat. First there was gi-ta-ta, 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 and then one slightly more complicated beat, gi-ta-ta, 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 ge-ta. As I began to play the beat, I kept speeding it up, and he kept telling me to slow down. He spent a lot of time just showing me how to strike the heads of the drum. Then I finally began to get it a little, but he had to keep admonishing me to slow down and pronounce the syllables as I hit the drum. Gi-ta-ta. The syllables, he said, and the drum should sound the same. I should make it sound like that and always pronounce them. I was determined and played very slowly for a long, long time. I was concentrating with great intensity. Then suddenly I was aware of Swamiji standing motionless beside me. I didn't know how long he was going to stand there without saying anything, and I became a little uncomfortable, but I continued playing. When I got up the courage to look up and see his face, to my surprise, he was moving his head back and forth in an affirming way with his eyes closed. He seemed to be enjoying the lesson. This came as a complete surprise to me. Although I had taken music lessons before and had spent many years taking piano lessons, I can never remember an instance when the teacher seemed to actually enjoy my playing. I felt very wonderful to see that here was a teacher who was so perfect, who enjoyed what he was teaching so much, not because it was his personal teaching or his personal method, but because he was witnessing Krishna's energy pass through him to a conditioned soul like myself. And he was getting great pleasure out of it. I had a deeper realization that Swamiji was a real teacher, although I had no idea what a spiritual master really was. Unquote. To Mukunda's wife, Janaki, Krishna consciousness meant dealing in a personal way with Swamiji. As long as he was around, she was all right. She enjoyed asking him questions, serving him, and learning from him how to cook. She didn't care much for studying the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, but she quickly developed an intense attraction for him. Janaki. There were a group of us sitting around in Swamiji's apartment, and I asked him if he had any children. He looked at me as if I had said something strange, and he said, "You are not my child?" I said, "Well, yes." And he said, "Are not all these my children?" And his answer was so quick that I never doubted that he seriously meant what he said. For several hours each morning, Prabhupada showed Janaki, Joan, and others how to cook. One day in the kitchen, he noticed a kind of berry he had never tasted, and he asked Janaki what they were. She told him, "Strawberries." Wow. He immediately popped one into his mouth, saying, "That's very tasty." And he proceeded to eat another and another, exclaiming, "Very tasty." One time Janaki was making whipped cream when Prabhupada came into the kitchen and asked, "What's that?" She replied, "It's whipped cream." What is whipped cream?" he asked. "It's cream," she replied, "but when you beat it, it fluffs up into a more solid form." Although always adamant about kitchen rules, one of the most important being that no one could eat in the kitchen, Srila Prabhupada immediately dipped his finger into the whipped cream and tasted it. "This is yogurt," he said. In a light-hearted, reprimanding way that was her pleasure, Janaki replied, "No, Swamiji, it's whipped cream." Srila Prabhupada corrected her, "No, it is yogurt." And again he put his finger into it and tasted it, saying, "Oh, it tastes very nice." "Swamiji," Janaki accused him, "you're eating in the kitchen." Srila Prabhupada merely smiled and shook his head back and forth, saying, "That is all right." Janaki. One time I told him, "Swamiji, I had the most exciting dream. We were all on a planet of our very own, and everybody from earth had come there. They had all become pure devotees, and they were all chanting. You were sitting on a very special chair, high off the ground, and the whole earth was clapping and chanting Hare Krishna." Swamiji smiled and said, "Oh, that's a lovely dream." Bonnie MacDonald, age 19, and her boyfriend, Gary McElroy, 20, had both come to San Francisco from Austin, where they'd been living together as students at the University of Texas. Bonnie was a slight, fair blonde with a sweet southern drawl. She was born and raised in Southeast Texas in a Baptist family. In high school, she had become agnostic, but later, while traveling in Europe and studying the religious art there and the architecture of the great cathedrals, she had concluded that these great artists couldn't have been completely wrong. Gary, the son of a U.S. Air Force officer, had been raised in Germany, Okinawa, and other places around the world before his family had settled in Texas. His dark hair and bushy brows gave him a scowling look, except when he smiled. He was one of the first students at the University of Texas to wear long hair and experiment with psychedelic drugs. While taking LSD together, he and Bodhi had become obsessed with the idea of going on a spiritual search. And without notifying their parents or school, they had driven to the West Coast in, quote unquote, in search of someone who could teach us about spiritual life. They had spent a few frustrating months searching through spiritual books and amongst spiritual groups in Haight-Ashbury. They had become vegetarians. Gary had started teaching himself to play electric guitar, while Bonnie had gone to Golden Gate Park every day to perform a self-styled Hatha Yoga meditation. But gradually they had become disillusioned and had felt themselves becoming degraded from drugs. Well, that's for sure. Oh my gosh, degraded by drugs. When the disciple is ready, the guru will appear. They had read, and they had waited eagerly for the day when their guru would come. Although Bonnie had spent most of her time in the parks of San Francisco, one day she'd been looking through a table full of magazines in a Haight-Ashbury head shop when she'd found a copy of Back to Godhead, the mimeographed journal produced by Srila Prabhupada's disciples in New York. She'd been particularly attracted to Hayagriva's article about Swamiji. The descriptions of Swamiji's smile, his bright eyes, his pointy-toed shoes, and the things he had said had given her a feeling that this might be the guru she had been looking for. And when she learned that the same Swamiji had opened an ashram in Haight-Ashbury, she immediately started searching through the neighborhood until she had found the temple on Frederick Street. Before Bonnie and Gary met Swamiji, they had both been troubled. Gary was in anxiety about the threat of being drafted into the army, and both of them were disillusioned because they had not found the truth they'd come to San Francisco to find. So on meeting Srila Prabhupada in his room, they began to explain their situation. Bonnie, he was sitting in a rocking chair in his little apartment, and he looked at us like we were crazy, because we were, and said, "You come to my classes." So he said, Prabhupada said, "You come to my classes. Simply come to my classes every morning and every evening, and everything will be all right." That sounded to us like an unbelievable panacea, but because we were so bewildered, we agreed to it. I told him I had traveled all over Europe, and he said, "Oh, you've traveled so much." And I said to him, "Yes, I've traveled so much. I've done so many things, but none of them ever made me happy." He was pleased with that statement. He said, "Yes, that is the problem." We began going to his morning lectures. For us, it was a long distance to get there at 7 in the morning, but we did it every morning with the conviction that this was what he had said to do, and we were going to do it. Then one day he asked us, "What do you do?" When we said that formerly we had been art students at college, he told us to paint pictures of Krishna. Shortly after that, we asked to be initiated. Joan and Roger were soon initiated, receiving the names Yamuna and Gurudas. And the very next day, they were married. At their wedding ceremony, Swamiji presided, wearing a bulky garland of leaves and rhododendron flowers. Sure. He sat on a cushion on the temple floor, surrounded by his followers and paraphernalia for the sacrificial fire. Before him was a small mound of earth where he would later build the fire. He explained the meaning of Krishna-conscious marriage and how husband and wife should assist one another and serve Krishna, keeping him in the center. Swamiji had commented that he did not like the Western women's dress, and at his request, Yamuna was dressed in a sari. Although Swamiji had called for ghee, clarified butter, as one of the sacrificial ingredients, the devotees, thinking ghee too costly, had substituted melted margarine. He had called for firewood also, and the devotees had supplied him the bits of a broken orange crate. Now, with Yamuna and Gurudas seated before him on the opposite side of the mound of earth, he picked up a small piece of the splintered orange crate, dipped it into what was supposed to be ghee, and held it in the candle flame to begin the fire. The splinter flamed, sputtered, and went out. He picked up another splinter and moistened it in the melted margarine. But when he touched it to the flame, it made the same svit sound and sputtered out. After trying unsuccessfully 4 or 5 times, Swamiji looked up and said, "This marriage will have a very slow start." Yamuna began to cry. Bonnie and Gary were initiated just 2 weeks after they had met Swamiji. Bonnie's initiated name was Govinda Dasi, and Gary's was Gaurasunda. Although still dressed in blue jeans, even at their initiation, and not professing to know much of what was going on, they had confidence in Swamiji. They knew that their minds were still hazy from drugs, but they took their initiation seriously and became strict followers. Gaurasunda threw out whatever marijuana he had, and he and Govinda Dasi began eating only food they'd offered to Krishna. 2 weeks after their initiation, Swamiji conducted their marriage ceremony. On the evening of the wedding, Govinda Dasi's father came from Texas, even though he objected to Krishna consciousness consciousness as radically un-American. Walking up to Srila Prabhupada's seat in the temple, Govinda Dasi's father asked, "Why do you have to change my daughter's name? Why does she have to have an Indian name?" Prabhupada looked at him and then with a mischievous gleam looked at Mr. Patel, an Indian guest standing nearby with his family. "You don't like Indians?" he asked. Everyone who heard Swamiji laughed, except for Govinda Dasi's father, who replied, "Well, yeah, they're all right, but why does Bonnie have to have a different name?" "Because she has asked me to give her one," Srila Prabhupada replied. "If you love her, you will like what she likes. Your daughter is happy. Why do you object?" The discussion ended there, and Govinda Dasi's father remained civil. Later he enjoyed taking prasadam with his daughter and son-in-law, Govinda Dasi. Gaurasundar and I set about reading the 3 volumes of Swamiji's Srimad Bhagavatam, and at the same time Swamiji had told me to paint a large canvas of Radha and Krishna and a cow. So every day for the whole day I would paint, and Gaurasundar would read out loud from the Srimad Bhagavatam, 1 volume after another. We did this continuously for 2 months. During this time, Swamiji also asked me to do a portrait of him standing before a background painting of Lord Chaitanya dancing. Swamiji wanted it so that Lord Chaitanya's foot would be touching his head. I tried. It was a pretty horrible painting, and yet he was happy with it." Unquote. Prabhupada's thoughtful followers felt that some of the candidates for initiation did not intend to fulfill the exclusive lifelong commitment a disciple owes to his guru. Swamiji, they would say, "Some of these people come only for their initiation. We've never seen them before, and we never see them again." Srila Prabhupada replied that was the risk he had to take. One day in a lecture in the temple, he explained that although the reactions for a disciple's past sins are removed at initiation, the spiritual master remains responsible until the disciple is delivered from the material world. Therefore, he said, Lord Chaitanya warned that a guru should not accept many disciples. One night in the temple during the question and answer session, a big bearded fellow raised his hand and asked Prabhupada, "Can I become initiated?" The brash public request annoyed some of Prabhupada's followers, but Prabhupada was serene. "Yes," he replied, "but first you must answer 2 questions. First one, who is Krishna?" The boy thought for a moment and said, "Krishna is God." "Yes," Prabhupada replied, "and who are you?" Again the boy thought for a few moments and then replied, "I'm the servant of God." "Very good," Prabhupada said. "Yes, you can be initiated tomorrow." Whew. It was only in the very beginning stages Prabhupada did like that. After a couple of years or less, he introduced recommendations. Srila Prabhupada knew that it would be difficult for his Western disciples to stick to Krishna consciousness and attain the goal of pure devotional service. All their lives they had had the worst of training, and despite their nominal Christianity and philosophical searching, most of them knew nothing of the science of God. They did not even know that illicit sex and meat eating were wrong. Although when he told them, they accepted what he said, and they freely chanted Hare Krishna, so how could he refuse them? Of course, whether they'd be able to persevere in Krishna consciousness, despite the ever-present attractions of Maya, would be seen in time. Some would fall. That was the human tendency. But some would not. At least those who sincerely followed his instructions to chant Hare Krishna and avoid sinful activities would be successful. He gave the example that a person could say that today's fresh food, if not properly used, would spoil in a few days. But if it is fresh now, to say that in the future it will be misused and therefore spoil is only a surmise. Yes, in the future anyone could fall down, but Prabhupada took it as his responsibility to engage his disciples now. And he was giving them the methods which, if followed, would protect them from ever falling down. Aside from Vedic standards, even by the standard of Swamiji's New York's disciples, the devotees in San Francisco were not very strict. Interesting. Some continued going to the donut shop, eating food without offering it to Krishna, and eating forbidden things like chocolate and commercial ice cream. Oh, Krishna. Some even indulged in after kirtan cigarette breaks right outside the temple door. Some got initiated without knowing precisely what they had agreed to practice. Kirtanananda. The mood in San Francisco was a lot more relaxed. The devotees liked to go to the corner and have their coffee and donuts. But Prabhupada loved the way so many people were coming, and he loved the program at the Avalon Ballroom. But there were two sides. Those who strictly followed the rules and regulations and emphasized purity, and then those who were not so concerned about strictness, but who wanted to spread Krishna consciousness as widely as possible. Swamiji was so great that he embraced both groups. Unquote. Michael Wright, 21, had recently got out of the Marine Corps, and Nancy Grindle, 18, was fresh out of high school. They had met in college at Los Angeles, feeling frustrated and in need of something tangible to which to dedicate their lives. They had come to San Francisco to join the hippies. But they soon realized that they and the Haight-Ashbury hippies, whom they found dirty, aimless, unproductive, and lost in their search for identity, had little in common. So Nancy took a job as a secretary for the telephone company, and Michael found work as a lineman for the electric company. Then they heard about the Swami in Haight-Ashbury and decided to visit the temple. It was an evening kirtan, and the irrepressible hippies were whirling, twisting, and wiggling. Michael and Nancy took a seat on the floor off to one side, impressed more by the presence of the Swami than by the kirtan. After the kirtan, Prabhupada lectured, but they found his accent heavy. That's what I found, frankly. It took not long, but it did take a little while to tune in. They wanted to understand. They had an innate feeling that he was saying something valuable, and yet the secrets seemed locked behind a thick accent and within a book written in another language. They decided to come back in the morning and try again. At the morning program, they found a smaller group, a dozen devotees with beads for chanting draped around their necks, a few street people. The kirtan seemed sweeter and more mellow, and Michael and Nancy chanted and danced along with the devotees. Then Prabhupada spoke, and this time they caught a few of his ideas. They stayed for breakfast and became friends with Mukunda and Janaki. Sam and Marjorie, now Shamsunda and Malati, Yamuna and Gurudas, and Govindadasi and Gaurasunda. They liked the devotees and promised to come again that evening. Soon they were regularly attending the morning and evening programs, and Nancy, along with the other women, was attending Prabhupada's weekend cooking classes. Michael was open to Prabhupada's ideas, but he had difficulty accepting the necessity of surrendering to a spiritual authority. His tendency was to reject authorities. But the more he thought about it, the more he saw that Prabhupada was right. He had to accept an authority. He reasoned, every time I stop at a red light, I'm accepting an authority. And finally he concluded that to progress in spiritual understanding, he would have to accept a spiritual authority. Yet, because he didn't want to accept it, he was in a dilemma. Finally, after hearing Prabhupada's lectures for 2 weeks, Michael decided to surrender to Prabhupada's authority and try to become Krishna conscious. Michael, Nancy and I decided to get married and become Swamiji's disciples and members of his society. We told some of the devotees, we would like to see Swamiji. They said, yes, just go up. He's on the 3rd floor. We were a little surprised that there were no formalities required. And when we got to the door, his servant Ranchor let us in. We went in with our shoes on, so Ranchor had to ask us to take them off. I didn't know exactly what to say to Swamiji. I was depending on my future wife to make the initial opening, but then I finally said, we came because we would like to become members of your Krishna Conscious Society. He said this was very nice. Then I said that actually the main reason we were there was that we wanted to get married. We knew that he performed marriage ceremonies and that it was part of the society's requirements that couples had to be duly married before they could live together. Swamiji asked me if I liked the philosophy and if I had a job. My answer to both questions was yes. He explained that first of all, we would have to be initiated, and then we could be married the next month. At their initiation, Michael received the name Dayananda, and Nancy received the name Nandarani. Soon, Prabhupada performed their marriage. Nandarani. We knew it would be a very big wedding. In Haight-Ashbury, whenever Swamiji would perform a wedding, hundreds of people would come and the temple would be filled. My parents were coming, and Dayananda's parents were also coming. Swamiji said that it was proper that I cook. He said I could come to his apartment on the morning of the wedding, and he would help me cook something for the wedding feast. So that morning I put on my best jeans and my best sweatshirt and my boots, and I went off to Swamiji's apartment. When I got upstairs, I walked in with my boots on. Swamiji was sitting there in his rocking chair. He smiled at me and said, "Oh, you've come to cook." I said, "Yes." He sat there and looked at me, one of those long silent stares. He said, "First, take off the boots." Ah, Krishna. After I took off my boots and my old leather jacket, Swamiji got up and went into the kitchen. He got a very large pot that had been burned so thick on the bottom that practically there was no metal visible. He handed it to me and said, "We want to boil milk in this pot. It has to be washed." There wasn't a sink in Swamiji's kitchen, only a teeny round basin. So I went into the bathroom, put the pot in the bathtub, and rinsed it out. I assumed Swamiji didn't want the black off the bottom because it was burned on. So I brought it back to him and he said, "Oh, that is very clean. But just take off this little black on the bottom here." I said, "Okay," and got a knife and crawled into the bathtub and started scrubbing the black off. I worked and worked and worked, and I scrubbed and scrubbed. I had cleanser up to my elbows, and I made a mess everywhere. I'd gotten about half the black off. The rest seemed to be more or less an integral part of the bottom. So I took the pot back to Swamiji and said, "This is the best I can do. All of this is burned on." He said, yes, you've done a wonderful job. Now just take off this black that's left." Well, I remember washing pots. That was my first regular service. And the pots, they were big pots because we were a temple of at least 50, maybe 60 devotees. So, you need a good-sized pot. And there was no hot water. There was no soap. There was just Brillo pads and metal pads. And cold water. And I had to clean those pots. That was not easy. So I went back into the bathtub and scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed. It was almost midday when I came out of the bathtub with all the black scrubbed off the bottom of the pot. He was so happy when I brought the pot in. It was sparkling. A big smile came on his face, and he said, "Oh, this is perfect." I was exhausted. Then Swamiji welcomed me into his kitchen and taught me how to make rasgullas. We boiled the milk, curdled it, and then I sat down and began rolling the curd into balls on a tray. As I rolled the balls, I would put them in a little row along the tray, and every single ball had to be exactly the same size. Swamiji would take his thumb and first and second fingers and shoot the balls out of the row when they weren't the right size. And I would have to remake them until they were the right size. This went on until I had a full tray of balls all the same size. Then Swamiji showed me how to boil the balls of curd in sugar water. Malati, Janaki, and I were cooking in the kitchen, and Swamiji was singing. At one point, Swamiji stopped singing and asked me, "Do you know what your name means?" I couldn't even remember what my name was. He had told me at initiation, but because none of us used our devotee names, I couldn't remember what mine was. I said, "No, Swamiji, what does my name mean?" He said, "It means you are the mother of Krishna." And he laughed loudly and went back to stirring the rasgulas. I couldn't understand who Krishna was, who in the world his mother would be, or how I was in any way related to her. But I was satisfied that Swamiji felt that I was somebody worth being. Phew, that's amazing. To be somebody who it's worth being. I finished cooking that afternoon about 4 o'clock. And then I went home to get dressed for the wedding. Although I had never worn anything but old dresses and jeans, Swamiji had suggested to the other ladies that they find a way to put me into a sari for the wedding. So he bought a piece of silk to use for a sari. I went to Malati's house. She was going to try to help me put it on. I couldn't keep it on, so she had to sew it on me. Then they decorated me with flowers and took me to Swamiji and showed him. He was very happy. He said, "This is the way our women should always look. No more jeans and dresses. They should always wear saris." Actually, I looked a fright. I kept stumbling, and they had to sew the cloth on me, but Swamiji thought it was wonderful. The cloth was all one color. So Swamiji said, "Next time you should buy cloth that has a little border on the bottom, so it's 2 colors. I like 2 colors better." Then when we went downstairs to the wedding, Swamiji met my relatives. He spoke to them very politely. My mother cried a lot during the ceremony. I was very satisfied that she had been blessed by meeting Swamiji. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So we will continue, devotees, tomorrow. Vishaka Priya Haribol Gokuleshwari.